Nigel Farage, the former Brexit leader and, of course, GB News host. He joins us now from London. Great man. I started off tonight's program by talking about what's happening in China, that it feels like the protests that are happening in China right now, look, the CCP ain't going anywhere, but for people to be able to take to the streets, to organise in a fashion where the government isn't able to rip them off the streets because they're holding up the blank pieces of paper, the Western world should be starting to speak with the support for those people like they do for the Iranian women. But there's not much of it. A little something from Sunak last night, but the world's not really jumping to the defence of these people, are they?
Good Lord, no. There are far too many people in politics and big business and media making much too much money out of China for any criticism to be allowed. And you mentioned Rishi Sunak. Sunak said last night the golden era of Britain's relations with China are over. Now, the golden era is a period about 7 years ago when the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, the Chancellor, George Osborne, let China into our nuclear industry, let China into our telecoms industry, so that they could steal our industrial secrets, spy on us, do whatever they could to diminish our role in the world. But it was a golden era for the friends of the Conservative Party, for big businessmen, and people sitting as non-execs on the boards of Chinese companies. It wasn't a golden era for Britain, and we just need to understand that money, right across the Western world, money is the reason we don't condemn human rights abuses and all the dreadful things that regime do. I promise you, it's corruption at the highest level. I've seen it myself.
Well, also, it's this scenario where there is no one who pushes back on the proven situation that people, the Uyghurs, are being used as slave labour in part to build things like solar panels. There are some little dots of the world that have said, no, anything that comes from that region, we're not taking it. You would think that that would be the easiest of things for people to turn around and do. But the truth is that so much of what the Western world takes for granted is made in a sweatshop somewhere. Someone somewhere suffered for us to have it, and we just don't seem to care. We care when we're tweeting, but we don't care when we're consuming.
Well, that's right. And we've been happy to outsource so much of our industrial production of clothes, of wind turbines, of solar panels. We're happy to have, well, I always used to think of it as cheap Chinese rubbish, and still quite a lot of it is. But we've been happy to outsource. Well, we've been happy to outsource so much of this. And so we've now finished up through our own strategic stupidity, actually becoming quite dependent on many things that are made in China. Look, at some point in time, the only way we stop China from continued human rights abuses and possible invasion of Taiwan is a very big economic blockade. But we have to understand, as with Ukraine, when we put sanctions on, it's going to hurt us too. So we need perhaps all of us to start thinking about an industrial strategy where we become a little bit less dependent
100%.
On imports from China. And as for the protests, well, look, I'm very surprised because any attempt to protest in Hong Kong tends to be pretty brutally put down. This must be on a much bigger scale across China than perhaps even we understand. Otherwise, they would have cracked down, in my view. So something quite big is going on. But as ever with China, it's tough to get a big picture.
Well, correct. They keep telling us that no one's died of COVID recently. No one at all. Just 1 billion people living in that country right now. Let's talk about the tactic of the left right now, which is to push back against any sort of dissent against a constitutional amendment for a voice to Parliament for Indigenous peoples, is that to even offer a no or a maybe somehow becomes unthinkable, disgraceful, borderline or outright racist. I thought in a free country, and I still believe the majority of the people will end up voting for it, but you're allowed to hear the case against it.
Yes, I mean, look, I think the voice, the very concept itself is racist, not criticism of it. The idea that you single out a group of people on ethnic grounds and give them special rights is divisive, it is dangerous, it is racist in nature, and is likely to lead to great embitterment from other communities. It's a massive, massive mistake that is being undertaken here. And I'm really surprised, that Peter Dutton is not actually, we say, I'm waiting for details. You don't need to see the details. The idea is a bad one. And we've got to understand it's up to us on the centre and on the right to make the arguments that everybody should be treated equally before the law, that we want our societies to be as meritocratic as they possibly can be. I have to say, every time I've looked at this idea of the voice, and I was out there with you just a few weeks back, every time I look at this, I think it's an incredibly bad idea.
Now, obviously, there's a very good chance that you may have to get back in the ring at that next UK election. Now, is it true that you have had a couple of chats with people who only exist as members of the parliament because they were with Boris Johnson in the red wall that fell away, Conservatives in the north? Are these the people who end up being Nigel Farage's team that battles in a couple of years' time?
Look, to be honest about it, and I don't want to sound boastful, but none of those seats would have gone Conservative, and Boris Johnson wouldn't have been Prime Minister, if I hadn't done what I did. I got millions of people who'd come from families that had been voting Labour since the end of World War I, and they agreed with the stuff I was saying against the establishment. They voted UKIP. And then in the end, Brexit Party and then Conservative. I was the gateway drug. It was what I did that got them there. Look, we're in this, sort of fevered environment where if I'm seen having a cup of coffee with somebody, suddenly it means we're plotting some grand design. All I would say is that those red wall, as they're known, Conservative MPs, elected in 2019 in seats in which before it was unthinkable, they know that public trust and support in this government has fallen to absolutely rock bottom. As I speak to you, there are at least 12 migrant boats in the English Channel with 400 to 500 people on board. And what happens when they get processed? They get sent to these northern towns, they fill up hotels, they damage local economies. That's just one aspect of how this government has failed. But also, it's a betrayal of what the Brexit vote was. So these people know that unless something drastic changes, they are all going to lose their seats. The question is, under an absolute strict first-past-the-post electoral system, if I was to get back into this and lead a revolt, I'm sure millions would vote for it, but could we break the system? And that's the big debate that we're having. So do I meet these people? Do I talk to them? Of course I do. Does it get somewhat over-egged by the press? Well, that's the nature of the game.
Well, I certainly know that regardless of what people say is being discussed, I know from personal experience when we were in London, to be in your company is spectacular. Dare I say even grouse. All right, now finally here, before we go, let's talk here about Prince Harry. Apparently some mates are a little bit worried about where he currently is before the book and the doco come out.
Yes, they're worried because he's been revisiting tough times in his childhood, and undoubtedly he did have tough times in his childhood, and unlike all the rest of us, of course, that was played out in full public view. But I'm sorry, I've got no sympathy for this guy at all, and I tell you why. Because of the absolute disrespect he showed to his grandfather, Philip, literally on his deathbed, and he went ahead with that Oprah Winfrey interview. Huge disrespect to that great woman, his grandmother, the late Queen. The damage he's done to the institution. I have to tell you, I am not concerned in the least for Prince Harry's well-being. Sorry, that's where it is.
All right, thank you, Nigel. All the best. Look forward to talking to you next week.